Hi guys, it's Arielle. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, I wanted to talk to you about the Petit Trianon and the Queen's Hamlet at the Palace of Versailles. I have recently gone down the rabbit hole of doing all the guided tours at the Palace of Versailles. As I was writing my Fontainebleau guide, I learned a lot more about how the two palaces are linked. The Palace of Versailles isn't as old as the Château de Fontainebleau, and it has a very different purpose for the French monarchy. The Palace of Versailles was definitely the epitome of opulence. It was the highest point of French aristocracy, whereas the Château de Fontainebleau was very much a vacation home for the kings. It was a place that they would go for centuries, from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, to rest, to seek peace, to hunt. The two castles, the two palaces definitely served different purposes for the monarchy. And so in writing my guide, I became very interested in the Palace of Versailles. And now I'm in the process of writing a guide for Versailles. And to do the best job possible, I decided that there was no other way to start than by doing every single tour possible, which might not seem like a lot, but there are like dozens of tours that are available in both French and in English. And the tours change pretty often. What I found is that if you refresh the guided tours page, you'll have a new set of tours every week. They're pretty limited, like you might have one a month and then you'll have a different set of tours in the next couple months. There's just so much information that you have access to, particularly through these guided tours. And before I talk about the Queen's Hamlet and the Petit Trianon, which were the first set of tours that I did, I thought I would just mention why I always recommend doing your guided tours directly through the castle. This question comes up a lot during my consultations. People ask me about different tour companies that I recommend, if I've done Viator or if I've done this bus tour, and my answer is always the same. I very strongly believe that if you want to do a guided tour, the best way to go about doing that is through the castle or through the museum itself, for two reasons. Number one, it will be infinitely, exponentially more affordable to do the tour directly through the establishment. An example for you is I recently had a consultation call where a client was telling me that they were considering booking a guided tour of Versailles, and the tour was like 80 euros per person, and a very similar tour offered through the palace was 10 euros per person. So you can see just how different the price is. And then the second reason, possibly more important, is that when you do a guided tour directly through the museum or directly through the palace, you get access to areas and information that other people don't get to see. So a great example that we're going to talk about today is the Queen's Hamlet, which is a tour of the actual interior of the Queen's buildings, like the home that she had in the Hamlet. And so you can do a guided tour from a third party that will take you around and explain the history of the whole area, but it's only through the museum that you can access inside the buildings. And across the board, the tours will give you access to hidden rooms, to spaces that the general public can't see. And they're also the most informed on recent developments and discoveries when it comes to research that's being done about artifacts that they found or new developments in theories that they have. I do these tours quite often. I've specifically done the Queen's Hamlet tour 3 times now, and every time there's new information. I feel like I'm just ranting on about it, but I do really think there is extreme value in taking a guided tour through the establishments that you have in Paris. They're incredibly interesting, and even though they're not expensive, you feel very privileged. Like it's always so surreal for me to go to the Queen's Hamlet, to put on the shoe coverings that they make you wear, and to actually walk around these spaces that royalty got to be in hundreds of years ago. So that's it for my spiel on Versailles and the guided tours. Today, we are focusing on the tours that I did at the Petit Trianon. And within the Petit Trianon, you have the small palace that was built, you have the gardens, and then you have, of course, the Queen's Hamlet. So we'll talk a little bit about all of that today. And all the information that I'm going to give you has come from either these guided tours or my own personal reading. Like I said, I've been doing a lot of research on obviously the Château de Fontainebleau, but also the Palace of Versailles. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into today's video. The part of Versailles that we're going to be talking about today is called the Petit Trianon. I'll put a map of Versailles so you can see exactly where we're located. Versailles is quite vast. It's honestly huge. You have the castle gardens, you have the Grand Trianon, you have the Petit Trianon, and it takes a lot of time to walk from each point. I was saying this to Jean, but I can't imagine when people come to Versailles and want to see everything in just one day. We barely had enough time to do only the Petit Trianon in one day. I couldn't imagine running back and forth from the castle to the Trianon to the gardens. It's a lot of walking. Even just walking from the train stop to the Petit Trianon was 30 minutes. Never mind all the walking that we did in the Petit Trianon itself. When I'm talking about the Petit Trianon, I am of course referring to the smaller palace that was built here in 1758 for Louis XV. Now, this was a smaller palace that was built so that the king could appreciate his gardens that were here. He had a ton of greenhouses with over 4,000 different types of plants. And his greenhouses, his garden was considered to be the most beautiful in all of Europe. So that was the initial point of this castle. The goal of this area was to be able to appreciate the gardens. And even though the queen that's most known for the Petit Trianon and the Queen's Hamlet, of course, is Marie Antoinette, Louis XV's favorite, Madame du Barry, was actually the first woman to appreciate, to be able to spend time in the Petit Trianon. And I'll insert a picture of her bedroom because Marie Antoinette actually took over this same bedroom when she eventually moved into the Petit Trianon. Once Louis XV passed away, the Petit Trianon was passed down to Louis XVI, and it was Louis XVI who gifted the key to the Petit Trianon to Marie Antoinette. He said to her, "I know you love flowers, so here is a bouquet." So romantic. And it is a common misconception that Marie Antoinette was the very first woman queen in France to own property. She did not own the Petit Trianon. It was a gift, but it wasn't land that she owned. She did, however, have complete authority over this domain. And I'm not just talking about the decor or the architecture, I'm also talking about who could actually spend time in the Petit Trianon. If you weren't invited by the queen to this area, you were not allowed to step foot here. Now, before we get into the gardens and the Queen's Hamlet, I do just want to talk about a painting that I saw on the first floor of the castle of the Petit Trianon that I think is very interesting and tells an important backstory to who Marie Antoinette was at Versailles. These two paintings, which you'll see on screen, were commissioned for Marie Antoinette. They were gifted to her by her family. And you'll see Marie Antoinette depicted as a young child dancing with her other siblings at her older brother's wedding. And these paintings really brought a lot of joy to Marie Antoinette because she was extremely nostalgic and melancholic for her childhood. When she moved to Versailles, she was 14 years old. She was still a child. And in order to help her understand the customs of nobility and to familiarize herself with the palace and royal life in France, she was accompanied by women who were about 60 years old. So she really didn't have any friends or any companions in Versailles who were her age. And so she really was very, very nostalgic for the childhood that she had in Vienna. And I think understanding that allows us to understand the struggle that Marie Antoinette maybe would have had at Versailles and why she sought refuge, in a way, at the Petit Trianon and at the Queen's Hamlet. So as you leave this small palace at the Petit Trianon, you get into the gardens, which were completely redone by Marie Antoinette. She got rid of all of the greenhouses and she transformed the space into an English garden. Now, the difference between a French garden and an English garden is that a French garden assumes human strength is superior to nature, that human strength imposes its will on nature. And so you have these very manicured gardens with flowers that are intentionally planted in a certain way, the trees that are sculpted. That's a French garden. The English gardens, on the other hand, combined human presence with wild nature, and it's much more natural looking in a sense. You can tell that it was created, but it definitely looks more natural than a French garden. And as you're walking through these gardens, you'll come to the Temple d'Amour. And the point of the Temple d'Amour was sort of to have this picturesque destination point on a walk. It was always nice to walk somewhere. And when you were walking in these gardens, you walked to the Temple d'Amour. And Marie Antoinette loved walking. She had specific shoes and dresses that would allow her to easily walk in her gardens. And this was very different from other members of the nobility who preferred boating, for example. And an interesting anecdote that we learned about the Temple d'Amour on the tour that I took was that Marie Antoinette was very prudish. She did not like nudity in her living spaces. She didn't like to wake up in the morning, have her breakfast with naked people in the paintings and the sculptures around her. And so it's said that the reason why the naked Cupid statue is found at the Temple d'Amour is because she wanted it far away from the palace where she lived and spent her time. Now moving on to the Queen's Hamlet, probably the most exciting part of this video. You'll see it on screen, the different buildings that are part of the Queen's Hamlet, but essentially this was a play on rustic and local living, and it was meant to mirror a village from Normandy. And what's very interesting and specific to Louis XVI is that he was a king that really didn't travel much. The only place he ever traveled to was Normandy. And this is because at the time of his reign, there weren't any war campaigns that were going on, so there really wasn't a need or a reason to travel. And it wasn't exactly said outright on the tour, but it was definitely implied that because Normandy was the only place that the royal family ever got to visit, that's why the Queen's Hamlet mirrors a Norman village. What's interesting about the Queen's Hamlet and how it was designed is that it actually inspired Walt Disney in his creation of Snow White. Now, despite the fact that the Queen's Hamlet looks very charming, it looks like a place that you'd love to spend all of your time, it was actually only a summer residence. It was not in any capacity equipped for winter weather in France. And something else that's very interesting about the Queen's Hamlet is that all of the buildings that you see are literally just plopped on the ground. There is zero foundation for any of these buildings, and that's because the land in the Petit Trianon, while very fertile for the gardens and the greenhouses, is extremely marshy. So the land was far too wet and swampy to build any type of solid foundation. Another really interesting fact that I learned about the Queen's Hamlet on this tour is that Marie Antoinette never actually spent a night here. Like, she never slept over in her hamlet. It was basically a rule that the queen had to return to the Chateau de Versailles every evening and sleep in the palace. Now, there was one exception where she did sleep a couple nights in the castle, the palace of the Petit Trianon, and that's because she fell ill. I don't remember the illness that she had specifically. Measles. The queen had measles. But she used this illness as an excuse to say, oh, I don't want to get the king sick, so I better sleep at the Petit Trianon. And we know that this was kind of a bogus excuse because, and I'm so annoyed that I forget which illness she had, but the specific illness the king had already been inoculated to, so there wasn't really a risk of the king becoming fatally ill from the illness that Marie Antoinette had. But she nevertheless used it as an excuse to spend a couple nights in the Petit Trianon, but that's in the palace and not the Queen's Hamlet. I thought that was very sneaky. I think as well that the fact that she tried her luck at spending a couple nights in the Petit Trianon shows just how happy she was in this area. The Petit Trianon and the Queen's Hamlet are very representative of the happiest adult years of Marie Antoinette's life. And I think that this is in large part due to the fact that the Petit Trianon was really the only area where the queen wasn't under constant observation like she would have been at the palace. Something else that I learned on the tour about Marie Antoinette is that if she were alive today, she very likely would be a vegan. She did eat meat during royal meals because that was, required of her. but she definitely had a preference for vegetables and for fruits. And that's another reason why she adored coming to her hamlet, because she could eat anything she wanted from her gardens, and a large portion of the gardens were fruits and vegetables. And they had access to a very diverse amount of plants, really from all around the world. And so not only was it a place that she could come and she could be herself without constant observation, but she did have access to her favorite foods. Now, I want to take you guys inside with me to the Queen's residence in the Queen's Hamlet, and I want to talk about the restoration process and what you can find on the inside, because I think it's both shocking and disappointing. I say it's disappointing because you will not come across any original pieces from Marie Antoinette's time at the Queen's Hamlet. And this is because following the revolution in 1789, this area was looted. Everything was stolen. It is very rare to come across anything that would have touched the Queen's hands. What we do have in the Queen's residence is a reconstruction, is a reinterpretation of what the Queen's Hamlet and the Queen's residence would have looked like under Marie-Louise, who was Napoleon's wife. And so in 1811, following the revolution, we have Napoleon who occupies Versailles and the Petit Trianon, and his wife takes it upon herself to restore what she could of the Queen's Hamlet. And so today, when you walk inside of the Queen's residence, all of the furniture, the decor, the colors that you see are largely inspired by what the Queen's residence looked like under Marie-Louise. Now, on top of the looting, there were other difficulties in reconstructing the Queen's Hamlet based on what Marie Antoinette had created, and that is how the paint colors were described. And I'll give you a very funny example, is that we know one of the paint colors that Marie Antoinette used in the Queen's residence was called dolphin poop. Okay, that was the name of one of the paints that she used. And it's really hard to know what the color dolphin poop would have looked like. It's probably a mix of a brown and a green, but we don't really know, which makes repainting the rooms and touching up the rooms very challenging if we want to match the original colors as per Marie Antoinette. Now, one of the most intriguing rooms of the Queen's residence, and definitely the most opulent, is this beautiful yellow room. This is sort of the main room in this residence, and it was used as a salon, a place where you would entertain guests. What we know about this room is that it was definitely a lot less luxurious than the Palace of Versailles. A great example of this are the walls. Instead of woven tapestries covering all the walls, you have silk with the details painted on, which of course is very luxurious, but it's not as luxurious as what you'd find in the palace. And something else that's interesting to note about the furniture here is that nothing is an original, not even from Marie-Louise. The only piece that is an original is that center marble table that is from the time when Marie-Louise managed the Queen's Hamlet. Now, from the salon, you have access to the balcony, the terrace, and this was a treat because the very first time I did this tour, we did not have access to this area. We couldn't walk out, and today I did. And what I wanted to note on this balcony are the plants in pots. And what's very interesting about this is, like I mentioned, the Queen had access to thousands of different plants, fruits, vegetables. There were lots of plants that came from different areas around the world, lots of exotic plants. And the problem with exotic plants is that they really weren't made to resist the French climate. And so what the gardeners did is that instead of planting these exotic plants in the ground, they chose to put them in pots. And here you have potted plants on the balcony terrace, but also in the gardens at the time, they would have planted the exotic pots in sorry, They would have planted the exotic plants in pots and then put those pots in the garden, because when these exotic plants died a few months after their arrival, it made the most sense and it was the most efficient to just replace the contents of the pot as opposed to uprooting and replacing an entire section of the garden. The next room on the tour that we got to see is called the réchauffoir, which I think translates to the reheating room. And this was essentially an offsite kitchen because you were not allowed to have a kitchen inside the main building. There was a huge fire risk of burning down the entire main residence, and so the kitchen always had to be located outside. What's important and interesting about this room is that you have a bread oven, you have an open fire where you could roast meat, and then you have a little room around the corner which served as a pantry. Now, in terms of the meals that you enjoyed here at the Petit Trianon and the food you enjoyed when you were a noble in general, is that you had access to roasted meat. And enjoying roasted meat, preparing roasted meat, was an incredible luxury. It was a huge signifier of wealth. First and foremost, we have to remember that in the 12th century, it was basically banned for the common person to hunt animals, to have meat. 90% of a common person's diet in France was bred. And there's two reasons that I have stumbled on in my readings as to why hunting was banned for the common folk. Number one is that birds that you would hunt and eat were considered to fly at the height of royalty. And so anybody who wasn't royal couldn't enjoy the luxury of a bird. The second reason that I found is that French kings loved hunting. It was by far their favorite activity. That's why we see these castles like Fontainebleau and Versailles built around huge forests, because the kings loved to hunt. And what I read is that the kings banned hunting for anyone who wasn't nobility or who wasn't with them on their hunting trips, because they didn't want the ecosystem and their hunting grounds to be messed up. They didn't want anyone messing with the quantity of game that was accessible to them and available to them while they were hunting. So those are the two reasons that I have found that explain why hunting and meat was essentially banned for anyone who was of common folk. Another reason why enjoying roasted meat was a luxury is because when you roast meat for hours, the fat drips out. So you had to be very rich to permit yourself to lose the fat of the meat that you were able to consume. Now, the last building that we went into on this tour is called the Laiterie, which means creamerie. And this was a small building that Marie Antoinette had built so that she could consume and taste all of the dairy products that were farmed in her hamlet. What you'll notice right away is that this building is made up of entirely marble or fake marble, and that is to keep within the theme of dairy, so white. And you'll notice on the walls you have these fountains, and the plumbing of these fountains actually runs under. I didn't take a picture of it, but you can actually see like holes in the marble on the ground. And this system of fountains and plumbing in La Laiterie were meant as a type of air conditioning at the time to keep this building cooler. And in this building, the nobility and Marie Antoinette's guests were able to, like I said, taste the dairy products. One of the favorite things to be tasted here was strawberries and fresh cream. Now hold on to your hats because I am going to show you the only original piece from Marie Antoinette's time that I got to see at the Petit Trianon, and that is the dishware for the laiterie. So she had a specific set of porcelain dishware created for the laiterie for the tastings. You can see that the motif is cornflowers, and that was Marie Antoinette's favorite design. Something else that indicates that this was used for the laiterie are the actual shape of the bowls. They have a spout, which is a bowl that would have been used to pour cream or pour milk at the tastings. And this porcelain dish set you can actually see on the main level of the palace of the Petit Trianon. Future Arielle jumping in because there is one space that I forgot to tell you about that I didn't see on my tour of the Queen's Hamlet, but I did see on the second tour I did of the Petit Trianon, and that is the Queen's Theatre. And the reason why I want to show you inside the theater and tell you a little bit about it is because it's an incredibly rare opportunity to actually walk through the doors and see the theater with your own eyes. Everything here, except for the velvet seating, is original from Marie Antoinette's time, and so it's a very delicate and incredibly fragile space. The chateau really does limit the amount of people that can come in because they want to avoid any wear and tear, any dust in this area, and so not every tour gets to see the theater. We were just very lucky. Now, the reason why there's a theater at the Petit Trianon is because it was very important to Marie Antoinette. Because she moved to France as a child, she had to learn to speak French, and she did that by watching French theater, and so she was very fond of theater from her childhood to her adult life. And what's peculiar about the Queen's Theatre is what it's made of. So the most luxurious material that you'll find in theaters, like the theater at the Versailles Palace, for example, is marble. That is top luxury, top quality. Second to marble is wood, and after wood, the least luxurious material is cardboard. And that's actually what the Queen's Theatre is made of, painted cardboard, which is crazy because it looks very luxurious. Everything is gold, everything is painted. It looks marvelous. To be honest, you would never tell that it's cardboard. And another interesting anecdote that we learned about the construction of this theater that pertains to the hallways, which I didn't get a good clip of, but hopefully I can explain it well, is that in order to get from the outside of the theater to the actual theater itself, you have a very short and narrow hallway. And this was very intentional and had everything to do with lighting. When Marie Antoinette had this theater built, it was obviously lit up by candlelight, and one candlestick could last 3 hours, and you obviously couldn't change candlesticks during the performance, so you had a total of 3 hours to get people into the theater, to do the performance, and get people out of the theater. And so it was essential to have short and narrow hallways to make it the most efficient as possible for people to enter and sit at the theater. And what's interesting about candles as well is that at this time, they were very expensive. The cost of one 3-hour candle was approximately the salary of a person for 2 days. So it was an incredibly luxurious item and not something that you wanted to waste. And yeah, I just thought it was very interesting that they built the hallways of this theater based on how long a candlestick could last. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say about the Queen's Theatre. I hope that if you do a guided tour, you also have the chance to step inside. And that brings us to the end of today's video. That is pretty much all the interesting facts that I learned on the 2 tours that I took of the Queen's Hamlet and the Petit Trianon. I will leave the link to the tours down below. Keep in mind that they only do these specific tours in French, which is a shame because you can't access the inside of the Queen's residence without going on one of these tours. So if you are bilingual, I highly recommend. I will leave them linked down below. I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you learned something new about Versailles and about Marie Antoinette. If you have any questions, let me know down below, and I'll see you guys in my next video.